Hello there, everyone. I'm not sure any of you are here yet, but I'm gonna. But I'm gonna take a few minutes to share. So please excuse me while I do that. Okay, thank you for waiting. I'm here now. Thank you for sharing. Start says I went to share. Lana says hi everyone. Start says shared. Laugh out loud. Start says hi Lana. Turns out we don't have. Oh, there's Dolores, the first Facebooker to come in. Thank you. Hi Kay. How are you? So there I am in the picture, fully in the picture. Okay, lots to cover tonight. We, of course, have lots of problems, especially the climate problems. The new IPCC report is out. This piece sort of gives us the high points. This is from The Conversation, August 9th. The IPCC climate report. Profound changes are underway in Earth's oceans and ice. A lead author explains what the warnings mean. The lead author is Robert Kopp, who's a professor at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences and director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, of Rutgers University. He's a New Jerseyite then, right? Humans are unequivocally warming the planet. That's triggering rapid changes in the atmosphere, oceans, and polar regions, and increasing extreme weather around the world. The IPCC warns in a new report. The IPCC released the first part of its much anticipated sixth assessment report on August 9th, 2021. In it, 234 scientists from around the globe summarized the current climate research on how the Earth is changing as temperatures rise and what those changes will mean for the future. We asked climate scientist Robert Kopp, the lead author of the chapter on Earth's oceans, ice, and sea level rise, about the profound changes underway. What are the IPCC report's most important overall messages in your view? The interviewer asked of Kopp. At the most basic level, the facts about climate change have been clear for a long time, with the evidence just continuing to grow. As a result of human activities, the planet is changing at a rate unprecedented for at least thousands of years. These changes are affecting every area of life. Affecting every area of the planet. How do we know humans are causing climate change? And here there's a graphic of greenhouse gases from humans, combined from human and also natural causes. And there's the natural causes are illustrated there, and the aerosols from humans, are illustrated there. So clearly, we're the major cause of climate change. While some of the changes will be irreversible for millennia, some can be slowed and others reversed through strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But time is running out to meet the ambitious goal laid out in the 2015 International Paris Agreement to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. 2 Celsius equals 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Doing so requires getting global carbon dioxide emissions on a downward course that reaches net zero around or before 2050. I personally think it's got to be way before. What are scientists most concerned about right now when it comes to the oceans and polar regions? Global sea level has been rising at an accelerating rate since about 1970. Over the last century, it has risen more than any century in at least 3,000 years. In the years since the IPCC's fifth assessment report in 2013 and special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate in 2018, the evidence for accelerating ice sheet loss has become clearer. Over the last decade, global average sea level has risen at a rate of about 4 millimeters per year, 1.5 inches per decade. This increase is due to two main factors: the melting of ice in mountain glaciers and at the poles, and the expansion of water in the ocean as the ocean takes up heat. Ice sheets in particular are primarily responsible for the increase in the rate of sea level rise since the 1990s. There is clear evidence tying the melting of glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet, as well as ocean warming, to human influence. Sea level rise is leading to substantial impacts on coastal communities, including a near doubling in the frequency of coastal flooding since the 1960s in many sites around the world. The Average global temperature, including both land and sea surface, is now nearly 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degree Fahrenheit, warmer than the 20th century average shown here. It's 1.1 Celsius, nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit higher than in pre-industrial times. So there's the blue. And then there's the increasing red as the temperature rises. Very clear. That's the difference between the average annual temperature and the 20th century average in degrees Celsius. And you can see things start getting really serious just before 1980s. And since then, they've just gotten more and more and more serious compared to the average annual temperature of the 20th century. Since the previous report, scientists have made substantial advances in modeling the behavior of ice sheets. At the same time, we've been learning more about ice sheet physics, including recognizing the potential ways ice sheets can become destabilized. We don't well understand the potential speed of these changes, but they have the potential to lead to much more rapid ice sheet loss if greenhouse gas emissions grow unchecked. These advances confirm that sea level is going to rise for many centuries to come, creating an escalating threat for coastal communities. Here's a really important statement. Sea level change through 2050 is largely locked in. Regardless of how quickly nations are able to lower emissions, the world is likely looking at 15 to 30 centimeters, 6 to 12 inches of global average sea level rise through the middle of the century. That's already baked in. We've already done that damage. But beyond 2050, sea level projections become increasingly sensitive to the world's emissions choices. If countries continue on their current paths with greenhouse gas emissions, likely to bring 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of warming, 5.4 to 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100, the planet will be looking at a most likely sea level rise of about 0.7 meters, a bit over 2 feet. A 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degree Fahrenheit warmer world, consistent with the Paris Agreement, would see lower sea level rise, most likely about half a meter, about 1.6 feet by 2100. There's a graphic of the global mean sea level change compared to 1900. What's more, the more the world limits its greenhouse gas emissions, the lower the chance of triggering instabilities in the polar ice sheets that are challenging to model but could substantially increase sea level rise. Under the most extreme emissions scenario we considered, we could not rule out rapid ice sheet loss leading to sea level rise approaching 2 meters or 7 feet by the end of this century. Fortunately, if the world limits warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, it should take many centuries for sea level rise to exceed 2 meters, a far more manageable situation. Are the oceans or ice nearing any tipping points? Quote, tipping point is, unquote, is a vague term used in many different ways by different people. The IPCC defines tipping points as, quote, critical thresholds beyond which a system reorganizes in a way that is very fast or irreversible, unquote. For example, a temperature rise beyond which climate dynamics commit an ice sheet to massive loss. Because the term is so vague, the IPCC generally focuses on characteristics of changes in a system For example, whether a system might change irreversibly or abruptly, rather than whether it fits the strict dynamic definition of a, quote, tipping point, unquote. One example of a system that might undergo abrupt changes is the large-scale pattern of ocean circulation known as the Atlantic the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, of which the Gulf Stream is part. Paleoclimate evidence tells us that AMOC has changed rapidly in the past, and we expect that AMOC will weaken over this century. If AMOC were to collapse, it would make Europe warm more slowly, increasing sea level rise along the U.S. Atlantic coast and shift storm tracks and monsoons. However, most evidence indicates such a collapse will not happen in this century. There's a graphic describing how the Gulf Stream is expected to weaken, but not to cease. There's mixed evidence for abrupt changes in the polar ice sheets, but clear evidence that changes in the ice sheets can be locked in for centuries and millennia. If the world succeeds in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 Fahrenheit, we expect to see about 2 to 3 meters, 7 to 10 feet of sea level rise over the next 2,000 years. If the planet continues to warm and reaches a 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit increase, we expect to see about 20 meters, 70 feet over the next 2,000 years. Some people will discuss summer Arctic sea ice, which has undergone substantial declines over the last 40 years and is now smaller than any time in the past 1,000 years, as a system with a, quote, tipping point, unquote. However, the science is pretty clear that there is no critical threshold in this system. Rather, summer Arctic sea ice area decreases roughly in proportion to the increase in global temperature. And if temperature was stabilized, we would expect sea ice area to stabilize also. Okay, I'm not going to go through the rest of this. I have a lot of other things to go through. But this report is even much more serious than the 2018 report. It makes it clear that things are happening much faster than was thought in 2018, and that there is great risk of extreme weather events. So that great change is happening. Here's a piece on what I consider to be a second aspect of climate change. There are people who don't agree that the pandemic was somehow caused by climate change, but I believe the link is very, very likely. And we will uncover it sometime in the next couple of years, and it will be linked somehow to changes in the climate. Anyway, for purposes of this live stream, I'm going to consider it as part of that. So this is a piece on if a vaccine-resistant strain develops in Africa, will Dr. Fauci lose his job? This is from Common Dreams. On August 4th, it's by Dean Baker from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, one of the founders. He said, this is a very serious question, even if I'm using a bit of clickbait here. I'm not out to get Dr. Fauci, who deserves some sort of Nobel Prize. for trying to give straight information to the public, even as Donald Trump is doing everything he could to minimize the pandemic. But there is an important issue of both our current failings in vaccinating the world and a system that almost always allows those at the top to escape responsibility for their failures. I've gone on at length before about the need to vaccinate the world. The spread of the Delta variant should make the point obvious to everyone. The more the virus spreads, the more it has opportunities to mutate. I've warned about that too on a number of occasions, haven't I? We are actually fortunate with the Delta variant, so it seems our vaccines are still effective in reducing the risk of infection and very effective in reducing the risk of severe illness or death. But this is just luck. If the pandemic spreads enough, we will see more mutations. It is entirely possible that a new strain will develop against which our vaccines provide us little or no protection. It may be the case, as Pfizer and Moderna claim, that it will be possible to quickly design an effective mRNA vaccine against a new strain. But even the best case scenario, where it takes just a few weeks to develop a new vaccine, it will still be many months before it can be tested, produced, and distributed to hundreds of millions of people across the country and billions across the globe. In the meantime, we will be seeing a whole new round of infections and deaths, as well as trillions of dollars of lost economic output. Just to be clear, these trillions in lost output is not just an issue of stacks of dollar bills in a vault. This translates into people going without food, shelter, no medical care, other basic needs. Rich countries have the resources to largely protect their populations for most of the economic impact of the pandemic. Developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America do not. Of course, even for the rich countries, it will mean trillions more in government debt. That means a lot to some people when a Democrat is in the White House. Open source alternative. The drug companies will tell us they're actually doing the best they can in getting the world vaccinated. They have, in fact, actually ramped up their production considerably, although the bulk of their vaccines is still going to wealthy countries. But the real question is whether we could be producing more vaccines, taking advantage of capacity not only in rich countries, but in countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, Pakistan, and other developing countries with potential manufacturing capacity. Our friends in the pharmaceutical industry tell us that manufacturing these vaccines is a complex process. It can't just be done overnight. Of course, everyone in the world understands that it can't be done overnight, which is why many of us were advocating ramping up capacity a year and a half ago. The pharmaceutical industry has been engaged in a filibuster, at least since October, when South Africa and India introduced their WTO resolution for suspending intellectual property rules for the duration of the pandemic, telling us it takes time to increase production. And if we had focused on increasing production at the time they began their filibuster, we could have produced many more vaccines by now. The logic of open sourcing vaccines is that we would put the details of the manufacturing process for the vaccines on the web, allowing engineers around the world to study them as the basis for new facilities or converting existing ones. Ideally, the engineers for the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and the rest, including the Chinese, Russian, and Indian vaccine, should also be available to conduct webinars and to provide in-person guidance. Last month, I was on a panel but someone from the pharmaceutical industry who questioned how this sort of transfer could be legally required. I pointed out that we, the U.S. and other rich country governments, should offer to pay a reasonable price for this expertise. If the drug companies refuse, then we should go directly to their top engineers and offer them exorbitant pay, e.g. $1 to $2 million a month, for sharing their knowledge. Since they are undoubtedly bound by non-disclosure agreements, the governments would also have to commit to cover their legal expenses and any payments resulting from lawsuits. The drug industry lawsuits for sharing life-saving information in a pandemic should at least help to clear up any ambiguity about their reason for existence. If vaccinating the world was treated as a real emergency, does anyone doubt something like this would happen? If GE or Lockheed had developed a new sonar in World War II that made it easier to detect German submarines, anyone think we would just sit there and say that this is proprietary knowledge and nothing can be done if the companies chose not to share it with the government? In addition to sharing existing knowledge, open sourcing the production process should also allow for innovations that would increase production. The official position of the industry is that they have mastered the process for manufacturing their vaccines, and it cannot possibly be improved. This claim is absurd on its face. In February, Pfizer announced it had discovered a way to cut its production time in half. Pfizer also discovered that its vaccine did not have to be super frozen at temperatures of less than minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but instead could be stored in a normal freezer for up to 2 weeks. This makes a huge difference in transporting its vaccine, especially in developing countries. Pfizer also discovered that its standard vial contained material for 6 doses rather than just 5. As a result of this mistake, 1/6 of the Pfizer vaccines were being thrown down the toilet for the first couple of months after it was approved. Given this history, it's hard to believe there's no way to further improve on the production processes of Pfizer or the other vaccine manufacturers. If engineers all around the world had the opportunity to inspect their methods, surely many would be able to come up with innovations that could speed up the production and distribution of vaccines. As much as the industry and politicians might want to pretend there is no way to accelerate the production of vaccines, that story is not credible. We had an alternative path that would have required the sharing of knowledge and expertise and overriding patent rights. We did not go this path. Thus far, we have been very fortunate. No vaccine-resistant strain has yet developed and spread widely. Hopefully, the world's good luck in this respect will continue as we vaccinate the developing world. However, slowly, it is worth knowing that even with the spread of the Delta variant, the number of new cases in former hotspots like India and Brazil has fallen sharply in recent weeks. This is presumably the result of many people enjoying some immunity from previous infections, as well as increasing levels of vaccination. But we certainly can't take for granted that a vaccine-resistant strain will not develop, and if that happens, and we face the horror story of having to go through a whole new round of infections and shutdowns, the question is whether anyone will be held accountable. My guess is that the answer will be no. Who ended up unemployed because of the war in Iraq or the housing bubble? The major media outlets would likely pretend there was nothing that could have been done. They may acknowledge that we could have been somewhat quicker in getting out our vaccines to developing countries, but they will not acknowledge even the possibility that open source technology could have sped up the production process for vaccines in both rich and developing countries. The idea that millions of people will needlessly die because our political leaders did not want to jeopardize the profits of the pharmaceutical industry is too horrible to be aired in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, and National Public Radio. But I have to add, not too horrible to be aired on the In-Depth show. The long and short is that in our high-tech, globalized economy, accountability is only something that those at the bottom have to worry about. Dishwashers and truck drivers get fired when they mess up on the job. Top public health officials, and indeed the whole public health profession, are largely immune from this sort of accountability for infinitely bigger mess-ups. And that is right. Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. This was written by Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and his books are listed there. So, that's one thing we can do about one of the climate-related problems, specifically COVID. And it's something we really ought to do as well. However, we also have politics. COVID and climate change, those crises are getting increasingly dangerous because the virus can mutate and because climate is continuing to rapidly change. And we're losing ice. What is the political system doing about this? What are our politicians doing? And the rest of the show will be about what our politicians. But let us share now a piece from the week by my favorite writer over there, namely Ryan Cooper. Says American government is heading for a climate-induced legitimacy crisis. In other words, the government is going to lose the legitimacy it has because of its failure to cope with the climate crisis. Ryan wrote this today. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, probably the largest scientific collaboration in human history, has produced its sixth assessment report on climate change. And the base conclusion is fairly straightforward. Scientists are ever more certain the global temperature is rising, that it is caused by humans, that all manner of extreme the weather events are connected to this warming. As a pseudonymous physicist summarized, quote, "It's real. It's us. There's strong agreement amongst the relevant experts. The impacts could be really severe. We can still do things to limit the impact." And Ryan says, the threat is dire. Every part of the United States will be harmed by unchecked global warming. Some are getting hit worse than others, but nowhere is immune, while poorer countries will have it worse still. With just 1 degree Celsius of warming, America has experienced a summer of rolling climate disasters. At 1.5 degrees and beyond, the damage will be much, much worse. Yet there's no sign that our political system is taking this threat at all seriously. It raises the question of whether climate change will be the thing that finally topples the already creaking American constitutional system. In Washington, nearly the whole summer has been eaten up with talks around the bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes little climate policy. But Democrats are hoping to pass a separate reconciliation bill with about $3.5 trillion in additional spending over 10 years, or roughly 1% of GDP. That's a modest bill. But even if that was entirely climate stuff, only a small part actually is, it is maybe a fifth the size of what a serious attack on climate change would be. So progress is being made, but it's just not anywhere near the scale of the problem. And because Democrats will likely lose control of the House of Representatives at least next year, and Republicans don't believe in doing anything about the climate problem, that will probably be it for climate policy for the rest of the decade, if not longer. That's doomsday, folks, isn't it? If conservatives succeed in their plot to destroy fair elections at all levels of government and set up one-party rule, that will be it for the indefinite future. And traditionally, when a government fails to address a giant looming threat, it raises the chance of a revolution. Now such an event is quite scary, and both conservative and moderate forces have spent generations whipping up fear of Jacobins and guillotines. This leads to a common misconception, though, that revolutions are the result of people deciding to overthrow the government. This leads to a common misconception, though, that revolutions are the result of people deciding to overthrow the government. As listeners of historian Mike Duncan's excellent podcast, the Revolutions podcast, can tell you, this gets the causality mostly backward. Actions from revolutionaries, of course, do matter. But the primary causal factor in virtually every revolution in history has been the rottenness and incompetence of the status quo political regime. If a government can ensure a modicum of economic prosperity and keep a solid grip on the armed forces, then revolutions almost never have a chance. And since by the end of his reign, Tsar Nicholas II's record of constant failure was so appalling that nearly the entirely Russian political spectrum, from communists to ultra-conservative supporters of the monarchy, was united against him. His horrifying misrule convinced even die-hard autocrats that the country could not survive with an incompetent dolt at the apex of power. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith, Jamie Galbraith's father, made a similar observation about the failure of the elite in Ancien Regime France to head off the revolution. In 1774, Turgot became Controller General of France. He was a leading Enlightenment figure, by the way. And his immediate task was to curb the expenditures of the French court. He failed. A firm rule operated against him. People of privilege almost always prefer to risk total destruction rather than surrender any part of their privileges. But intellectual myopia, often called stupidity, is a reason. There's also the invariable feeling that privilege, however egregious, is a basic right. The sensitivity of the poor to injustice is a small thing as compared with that of the rich. So it was in the ancien regime when reform from above became impossible. Then the revolution from below became inevitable. This is from The Age of Uncertainty. It follows that if one fears revolution, then by far the most important thing to do is make the extant political system function. This is one of Franklin Roosevelt's main motivations for the New Deal, as historian Eric Rauschway writes in his book, Winter War. FDR worried that if the Great Depression was not cured somehow, then either fascists or communists might topple the government. The millions who are in want will not stand by silently forever while the things to satisfy their needs are within easy reach, he said in a 1932 campaign speech. Now, I would be a fool to predict that revolution is definitely going to happen, much less when. But it's also impossible to deny that Galbraith's scheme could be plausibly applied to America's total failure to pursue climate policy at anything like a reasonable scale. Yes, we've known about the climate problem certainly since the 1960s and 70s, and we have almost a total failure to pursue climate policy. It has been due to neoliberal America, to the neoliberal elites taking over America. First, there was Reagan, of course, then Bush, the first, then Clinton for 2 terms, then Bush, the second, and then Obama, and then Trump. Everyone following neoliberal dicta. If the Democratic Party is not pursuing vigorous climate policy because America's archaic constitutional system was deliberately designed to make it nearly impossible to do anything, and because doing so would infuriate a lot of well-heeled interest groups the party is in bed with. The Republicans, meanwhile, are doing their absolute utmost to increase greenhouse gas emissions and make everything worse. Like most people, I find it very hard to imagine conditions getting so bad in the U.S. that people rise up and overthrow the basic structure of government. But I also suspect that few have really reckoned with how the coming years are going to inflame unrest and discredit the status quo. Climate disasters are regularly hammering almost every state. California is suffering its second largest wildfire in recorded history, and the record was set just last year. And its reservoirs are nearly out of water. Something like 40% of the country is in serious drought conditions. Yet again, it's gotten bad enough that major stories fly under the radar. For instance, I wasn't aware of the flooding in Omaha a few days ago until I started writing this article. And all that is just a tiny taste of what Americans are going to experience over coming decades. And people are suffering horribly, and their government is doing little to help them. It tends to fuel radicalization and extremism, like eco-terrorism. But revolution is a frightening prospect, to be sure. I would not be that confident that a better government would be the result instead of chaos and war. But if the American elite make that the only option available to have a prayer of saving the planet, some may decide it's a chance worth taking. I certainly agree with that. And you might agree with it too. So that's the warning from Ryan Cooper. And now we have the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed. And here's a piece on it It's called Bipartisan Bill Boosts Corporate Giants, and it's from the American Prospect at prospect.org. The title of the piece is Infrastructure Summer. I'm sorry, that's the title. Yeah, it's part of a series. Bipartisan Bill Boosts Corporate Giants, August 11th, 2021. There's a worker in Mason County, public by utility district, installing fiber optic cable, August 4th, 2021. The worker's name is Travis Sheets. That happened while he was working with a team to bring broadband service to homes in a rural area surrounding Lake Christine, near if Tuesday's passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act leads to even a significant portion of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda through budget reconciliation, it will herald a new age of government investment and intervention in the economy and a reversal of decades of pullbacks in public spending. But in another sense, the IIJA and potentially the companion reconciliation bill always carries on a tradition from the Clinton and Obama years of sidestepping big fights with corporate interests. It's not enough for Democratic lawmakers to have relearned how to spend money if they also continue to shy away from breaking power. One of the clearest examples of this is how broadband is treated in the IIJA. On the surface, a $65 billion investment in broadband, with an emphasis on getting low-income and rural households connected and closing the digital divide, is an unalloyed positive. But how much of that money will actually go toward meeting these goals, and how much will funnel into the coffers of incumbent telecom companies that for decades have resisted spending much money on rural and low-income deployment? The initial Biden proposal in the American Jobs Plan, which gave $100 billion to broadband, would have structurally reshaped the U.S. broadband market. It vowed to blanket the nation with coverage, increasing the minimum speeds that constitute a broadband internet. Importantly, it promised to prioritize support for broadband networks owned, operated by, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives, unquote, which are less constrained than the telecoms by profit motive and more willing to commit to universal services. And it stated it would override a series of laws on the books in nearly 24 states that prevent co-ops or municipal broadband networks from competing with established incumbents. Unfortunately, none of this made it into the final proposal. The $42.545 billion in state-level grants is prioritized to unserved areas, defined as areas with no access to broadband with at least 25 over 3 megabits per second, Mbps, which has been the standard minimum since 2015. Underserved areas, by contrast, are set at 100 over 20 BPS, which is the level grantees are supposed to hit. The original proposal sought a higher speed because unserved areas get the money first. Areas where the incumbent telecom should operate, quote, even if underserved, unquote, are unlikely to qualify for much funding. Smaller nonprofits, electrical co-ops, and muni broadband operations do not get priority The new language pointedly states that, quote, the program does not favor particular companies or providers, unquote. And the bill text confirms that on page 2058. Even worse, the bill does not nullify any state laws that restrict um, municipal broadband. So AT&T and Comcast can capture this pot of money, as they have in the past, without meaningful broadband adoption in unserved or underserved areas. As I wrote in my book, Monopolized, the Connect America Fund and the Federal Communications Commission provided at least $4.6 billion in subsidies for broadband deployment between 2015 and 2020, yet this had little effect on expansion. The IIJA grants 10 times that. However, monopoly telecoms have been skilled at picking and choosing neighborhoods to build out, only capturing the most profitable pockets. So a provision that mandates the FCC to prevent any digital by redlining, i.e. that picking and choosing, did make the bill, along with $14.2 billion for a voucher program of $30 per month to help low-income users pay for broadband, and $2.75 billion for teaching untrained people how to use the internet. Of course, such subsidies and training will also benefit the existing telecom firms that are offering broadband. The requirements for grantees to offer a low-cost price with no actual dollar figure attached to that and disclose their broadband rates are nice, but it's hard to comparison shop when there's only one carrier, as is often the case in many communities. Perhaps a little less money will be wasted when compared to previous federal broadband efforts, but without the competition elements, you're still hoping the broadband operators that snag the state grants, and given the lobbying that will go into it, incumbents would have to be favored, actually get the job done. The giant telecom companies have pronounced themselves happy with the bill after initial fighting it. That's because the structure of the heavy monopolized market remains intact. Congress failed to engage in any meaningful structural reform. As Biden said, nothing will fundamentally change. That's certainly true in this particular terrible bill. In one sense, this is the price Democrats paid for a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And it was a price extracted in other areas as well. Despite the initial plan to offset spending with rises in the corporate tax rates, practically no industry or wealthy individual will see taxes go up by a penny. The only one that might, cryptocurrency brokers, made a huge stink and got a compromise that didn't make it into the bill due to procedural complications, but will probably be implemented down the road. Climate measures were rolled back and transit funding cut in an assist to the oil and gas industry. The larger effort to privatize infrastructure was mercifully curtailed, but the management consultant industry won a lucrative mandate to write up reports on large-scale transportation projects. $66 billion granted to Amtrak won't help much if the monopoly freight, the railroads that control many of the corridors, aren't challenged. It would be more concerning if this trend followed in the Democrats' only reconciliation package. If the Democrats stick to their guns, at least $1.75 trillion in offsets, tax increases on corporations and the wealthy, savings from letting Medicare bargain for prescription drug prices must be found. Free community colleges strike at the business model of the for-profit college industry, whose profile of prospective students resembles that of the community colleges. In other cases, corporate America will line up for some of the potentially $3.5 trillion in public spending. The private equity industry in particular now controls a stunning amount of the care economy. Not only nursing homes, but hospice care, home health care, and child care facilities. I've heard they're lining up in meetings to seek their share of the bounty. Indeed, almost 2,000 companies and organizations have already lobbied on some aspect of the infrastructure bill, according to a Center for Responsive Politics analysis. None of this is to say that it's bad to spend 3 to 4 trillion on restoring public investments and rebuilding infrastructure and helping families. The recognition that government can play an important role in improving productivity, promoting the general welfare, and helping to solve the climate crisis is a genuine breakthrough on a level we haven't seen since the Great Society and New Deal initiatives. But many of these investments have been created to sidestep real questions of corporate power that have captured smaller such initiatives for decades. Federal money that gets shifted to consultants and large incumbent industries won't deliver on its promises. This problem is something that all the groups that cheered the selection of various anti-monopoly appointments now must wrestle with. The Biden administration has been willing to bare teeth against corporate power with personnel, but not with legislative policy. The broadband provisions stuck on page 2058 might not be as sexy as slogans about breaking up with Google and Facebook, but they are far more important to the question of whether large corporations will continue to dominate our economy and our lives. So that bill right now is a pig in a poke, that $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It's there to enrich the private sector corporations once more. It was part of a deal. If the centrists got that, then the deal was, that the progressives would get the reconciliation bill being structured by Bernie Sanders. As soon as that deal was verbalized and basically closed, the centrists started withdrawing from it. And right now, Sinema and Manchin are saying, we could never agree to 3.5T. They've clearly forgotten that Bernie came down from 6 trillion to 3.5T. I think what he should do is say, they're going to start, if centrists keep it up, they're going to start all over again and begin at 6T and see how the centrists like that. Anyway, there are other forces at play to try to handle that problem. And let us hope they can do it. I'm sharing the next one from Truth Out. Sanders unveils final 3.5T reconciliation package alongside the infrastructure bill. This one is, there's a picture of Bernie and Chuck Schumer, the two New Yorkers. And Sharon Zhang wrote this. It was on August 9th, 2021 for Truth Out. And Senate Democrats have unveiled their $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill with provisions like paid leave, expanding Medicare coverage, and proposals to tackle the climate crisis in the U.S. The Democrats plan on passing the bill alongside the bipartisan infrastructure package that's currently being debated. Well, it was actually passed in the Senate now. They just passed it. The reconciliation bill, spearheaded largely by Bernie Sanders, contains many of the provisions that were carved out of the infrastructure package that President Joe Biden had originally proposed in the spring. That includes traditional infrastructure provisions, such as funding for affordable housing, upgrades, and transportation. Included are proposals to support the human infrastructure in the country that were in Biden's American Families Plan, which will cut out of the bipartisan agreement completely. The bill also includes a proposal for federal paid family and medical leave, funding to make 2 years of community college tuition free, and a proposal for universal free kindergarten. Democrats included several provisions in the bill to address the climate crisis, crucial items that would not be able to pass the 60-vote Senate filibuster as it currently stands. The infrastructure bill, as climate advocates have pointed out, is Biden's and Democrats' last best chance to pass legislation that can achieve the president's goal of reducing 2005 emissions levels 50% by 2030. Investments in electrifying the federal vehicle fleet and buildings included in the bill go toward that goal. Also, proposals that climate advocates have long said are necessary for combating the climate crisis, such as the creation of a civilian climate corps and funding for climate justice programs, have been included in the bill. Inclusion of the proposals was a crucial aspect of this reconciliation package, as Republicans and some conservative Democrats are still determined to uphold climate denial, fighting against provisions to combat the climate crisis in the infrastructure bill and elsewhere. If climate proposals fail to pass through the budget by reconciliation process, which only requires a simple majority vote to pass legislation, their chances of passing the Senate are extremely low without filibuster abolition. The much vaunted healthcare proposals Democratic Party members have been fighting for in recent months are also part of the reconciliation bill. Democrats aim to reduce the Medicare eligibility age and expand Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing. The exact age for Medicare eligibility is yet to be made public, but Democrats have previously mentioned lowering it to 60 or 55 from the current threshold of 65. And so progressives have lauded the $3.5 trillion package as consequential, touting its provisions to help families and the working class while taking on climate change. Sanders touted the bill, of course. I won't read that quote. He also emphasized the bill would help to level the playing field between wealthy people in the middle and lower classes, with funding to both help enforce existing tax laws for the wealthy and achieve tax fairness, as a memo accompanying the bill puts it. Though some lawmakers have hailed the bill, still considered a compromise by and large by progressives, as Anna Malinoff pointed out, for Truth Out, incorporating that language. Okay, so as Anna Malinow pointed out for Truth Out, lowering the Medicare eligibility age slightly is a far cry from Medicare for All. The proposal to lower the eligibility age to 60 is even weaker than Hillary Clinton's in 2016, when she offered to lower the age to 50 or 55, even without the presence of a global pandemic. By the way, Alan Grayson made proposals like that in 2009 and 2010. So it's even worse than that. You don't have to go back to Hillary Clinton. You can go back as far as 2010 to hear people putting forward such proposals. As Jamal Bowman said on Twitter, the progressives had originally wanted $10 trillion. So the bill is already a compromise for the left flank of the party. It's not just a compromise. It's cutting away 2/3 of what they originally called for. We wanted $10 trillion, but still this is a badly needed investment, which is why more than 60% of Americans support the legislation. Bowen says this is a crisis, so here's my message to the Senate, hashtag, not one penny less, because $3.5 trillion was already the compromise. The American people want it. In fact, it's not too late to get that number higher. Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's get that number higher because it still stinks. Next, we get to the progressives. What the progressives are saying about this. Also from Truth Out. This one, I believe, from William Rivers Pitt. Yep, on August 11th. In 1974, Muhammad Ali stepped into a boxing ring in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, to face formidable heavyweight champion George Foreman. And by most in the moment reports of the day, Ali spent the first 7 rounds of the fight getting the living Jesus beaten out of him. Foreman pummeled Ali with notorious power punches that started in his hometown of Houston and whistled into Ali's ribs, shoulders, and head. The assault was vicious and utterly relentless. All the while, Ali laid back on the ropes, totally defensive and seemingly doomed, until the bell rang for the 8th round and Foreman came out of his corner gassed. He had punched himself out against his docile, seemingly immobile opponent, and in a flurry of blows that shook the African night, Ali put the champion on his back. Once again, Muhammad Ali was the greatest. I wonder if President Biden has been reading his Plimpton Mailer and the other sports journalism artists of the day. It sure seems like it. The tactic Ali deployed that night is called the, quote, rope-a-dope, unquote. Lie back, let your opponent punch themselves out, survive the onslaught, and then pounce. Ali pulled it off in 74 to retain the title that was stripped from him, and he refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War. And it sure as hell looks like Biden did the same to Mitch McConnell this week. Quote, the Senate took a major step early on Wednesday toward enacting a sweeping expansion of the nation's social safety net, reports the New York Times, approving a $3.5 trillion budget blueprint along party lines that would allow Democrats to fund climate change, healthcare, and education members while increasing taxes on wealthy people and corporations. I think that's a bit of an overstatement. It would allow Democrats to fund some legislation on climate change, but nowhere near the $10 trillion that was said to be needed by progressives, nowhere near the $16.2 trillion in Bernie's platform, nowhere near the $42 trillion in Howie Hawkins' platform. You're talking trivial here, really trivial. But of course, it's revolutionary because we haven't seen anything remotely like that since FDR's time. Screw that. We need the $42 trillion now. After an unusual bipartisan approval of a $1 trillion infrastructure package a day earlier, the vote over unanimous Republican opposition allows Senate Democrats to create an expansive package that will carry the remainder of President Biden's $4 trillion economic agenda. I do have to recognize, in fairness, that added to the American Rescue Plan, that all totals what? Totals $6.6 trillion. $3.5 trillion plus $1.2 trillion for the infrastructure bill is $4.7 trillion, and then the $1.9 trillion for the American Rescue Plan, $6.6 trillion. After a seeming eternity spent watching McConnell disrupt the legislative priorities of Democratic presidents, often with a shamelessness that bent the very light, seeing these 2 huge bills pass right under McConnell's upturned nose was almost surreal. And McConnell even voted for the first half, if only to let the folks back in Kentucky know that he showed up for work that day. The second half where the real money and genuine change reside, survived every punch McConnell could throw. For months, it seemed like McConnell would successfully slow walk the bills to death. This has been his way for years. Quote, about negotiation, unquote, in Mitch speak, translates cleanly to, quote, run out the clock, unquote. And it looked for a long time, 7 rounds maybe, like Biden had absorbed few of the hard lessons learned by his Democratic predecessor. Then, like a sudden wind, came the last 48 hours, the 8th round of the match. The president came off the ropes and laid out the minority leader like so much laundry with the legislative 1-2 punch that, if signed into law, will change the face of the country. William Rivers Pitt, that is a damned overstatement. I'm sorry. I love your prose, but that is a damned overstatement. And Mitch McConnell and the GOP are not out of moves yet, but their new tactics will not take place in the chamber. The American Action Network, the House, the GOP leadership group, closely tied to the Congressional Leadership Fund, is preparing to roll out a $5 million ad blitz attacking vulnerable House Democrats over the volume of spending in this bill. These attacks could make it difficult for Speaker Pelosi to hold her caucus together. However, it's worth remembering that these bills are wildly popular among a broad swath of voters across the political spectrum. Attacking them and the House members who voted for them may come to be nothing more than a nifty waste of money. It might even not be just a waste of money. It might actually be a positive for the people who are getting attacked, because they can always counter with, look at what these fools don't like. They don't like the various things that you like. In these ads, they are asking you to betray yourself. Of course, because these are Democrats we're talking about, Democrats will be the main problem going forward. And McConnell is still staring up at the lights in that empty boxing ring, wondering what the hell just happened. And now the Joe Manchins of the world get their chance to knock the whole thing over. Quote, given the current state of the economic recovery, it is simply irresponsible to continue spending at levels more suited to respond to a Great Depression or Great Recession, not an economy that is on the verge of overheating, unquote. The West Virginia said in the Wednesday statement, quote, I firmly believe that continuing to spend at irresponsible levels puts at risk our nation's ability to respond to the unforeseen crises our country would face. I urge my colleagues to seriously consider this reality as its budget process unfolds in the coming weeks and months. But remember, Mitch promised to behave if he got his infrastructure bill. So maybe he's just going through the motions right now. I'm sorry, Joe Manchin promised to behave. Joe Manchin, along with Kyrsten Sinema, John Tester, and a clutch of like-minded moderates, quote unquote. Yeah, I think he should have said a pearl clutch of like-minded moderates, now stand as the most perilous impediment to the passage of this legislation, because 0 Republican votes will be forthcoming no matter the final language. All 50 members of the Senate's Democratic caucus, plus the vote of Vice President Kamala Harris in her role as President of the Senate, will be needed. One defection will be the whole game. Manchin and his crew come to the table with a very large stick, and they know it. Quote, Senate Republicans can stop Democrats from spending as much as $3.5 trillion more on social priorities like climate change in the coming months. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema can, though, and the GOP lobbying effort is already underway after 19 GOP senators boosted a bipartisan infrastructure plan past the filibuster and onto the House. And Republicans are yearning for results from their cooperation with Manchin and Sinema's efforts. Namely, they're hoping to persuade the senior Democratic senators from West Virginia and Arizona to buck their party and shave down the social spending bill by holding out their votes. On the House side, however, the nearly 100-strong Progressive Caucus is threatening to withhold support for the $1 trillion portion of this package until the Senate first approves the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. The Manchin corners of the Democratic House majority are making their nervous noises about the size of the bill, perhaps out of fear of that aforementioned GOP ad campaign. All of these challenges and more must be overcome, even as the text of the bill, sorry, I scrolled down too fast, even as the text of the bill is drafted and presented for review. If those bills survive the uphill climb to the verge of passage, Mitch McConnell has one weapon remaining: the debt ceiling. 46 GOP senators are warning that they will not vote to raise the debt ceiling as Republicans ramp up pressure on Democrats to increase the nation's borrowing limit on their own, reports The Hill. All but 4 members of the Senate Republican Conference signed on to the letter addressed to fellow Americans and released Tuesday night that warns that the 46 GOP senators won't support a debt hike regardless of whether it's attached to another bill or brought up on its own. The stakes could hardly be higher in the coming months, and the outcome is far from certain. On a pair of nights this week, however, Mitch McConnell decisively lost his title as Master of the Senate and about legislation that will actually help people saw the beginnings of daylight. Rope-a-dope, indeed. Rope-a-dope, indeed. Okay, on that note, we go, the Progressive Caucus responds with. And that response is in the form of a piece from Common Dreams. There's a picture of Jayapal making a face. Speaking at a Go Bigger on Climate Care and Justice rally on July 20th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. The headline is, "Our caucus is clear," quote unquote. House progressives say no bipartisan deal without the reconciliation bill. Despite Jake Johnson, August 10th, shortly after the Senate passed the $550 billion bipartisan infrastructure package on Tuesday. Well, it's actually $1.2 trillion, but it's only $550 billion in new spending. The CPC said a survey of its nearly 100 members showed that a majority of respondents are prepared to withhold their votes for the newly approved infrastructure bill until the upper chamber also green lights a sweeping reconciliation bill. In a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, 3 top CPC members, led by caucus chair Pramila Jayapal, wrote that their fellow progressive lawmakers were specifically asked, quote unquote, whether they would commit to withholding a yes vote on the bipartisan infrastructure deal until the Senate has passed the budget reconciliation legislation deemed acceptable by the CPC. Quote again, a majority of our respondents affirmed that they would withhold their votes in support of the bipartisan legislation in the House of Representatives until the Senate adopted a robust reconciliation package, reads the letter, which was also signed by Representatives Katie Porter, Democrat of California, and Ilhan Omar, Democrat of Minnesota. Quote, we therefore encourage you to continue coordinating closely between the 2 chambers, collaborating with the White House, and engaging with our caucus so that the reconciliation framework reflects our shared and long-standing investment priorities that the Senate first adopts this reconciliation package before House consideration of any bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the trio added. The letter does not specify how many of the CPC's 96 members responded to the survey, nor does it say how many members answered affirmatively. In a statement on Tuesday, Jayapal said the internal survey results affirm the urgency of ensuring that the Senate's desire to pass a narrower bipartisan infrastructure agreement does not come at the expense of the full scope of investments our communities need, want, and deserve. Our caucus is clear. The bipartisan bill will only be passed with a package of social, human, climate infrastructure reflecting long-standing Democratic priorities. Is passed simultaneously through budget reconciliation. We know that congressional Democrats are committed to delivering immediate transformational improvements for the lives of the American people and will hold firm to meet that promise, unquote. And there's a picture of the letter there, and you'll notice it was signed by Jayapal, by Katie Porter, and by Ilhan Omar. I thought they were going to have their caucus titles here. I think that Ilhan is the whip of the caucus. I think that Katie Porter is the policy director of the caucus, if I remember correctly. And Pramila Jayapal, of course, is the chair of the caucus. Maybe Katie Porter is the vice chair, but we now have a situation in the Congressional Progressive Caucus where there's a sole caucus chief, and that is Jayapal. It's no longer shared power in that caucus. Following the passage of the bipartisan bill, the Senate voted along party lines to begin debate on the $3.5 trillion budget resolution that Senator Sanders unveiled on Monday. There was a vote-a-rama. The bill survived the vote-a-rama. I think this was probably not sufficiently late to take that into account. But last night was the vote-a-rama, and the bill survived. I haven't heard of any ruinous amendments that actually got attached to the bill. I think the bill is still intact. So now it moves to the committees to flesh out details of the bill. Senator Sanders, the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, said in remarks on the Senate floor on Tuesday. But let us be clear. This idea of using reconciliation is certainly not a new idea when Republicans controlled the Senate. They used reconciliation to pass trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1% and large corporations. Well, today, it is true we will also use reconciliation, but we will do it in a different way. Quote, we will use it to help the working families of this country and not just the wealthy and the powerful. All I can say, Bernie, is I hope you got a commitment from Biden and from Harris before you went forward with this that there was going to be no parliamentarian nonsense this time. That they were just going to not take the parliamentarians' advice. Just ignore the parliamentarian. She is a paid employee. There is no obligation to listen to her. So Bernie was on the floor. That's all that's essential in this article. So I'm going on to the final piece. That sets up the conflict that we're now seeing. The conflict over the bill, the rightists, including rightists inside of the Democratic Party, are opposed to the 3.5T reconciliation bill, but they have a bill of their own they want. If the progressives hold firm, they're not going to get that until the reconciliation bill is passed. Let's see if the progressives have the strength they need to force the vote. This is a force the vote situation. To force the vote for something valuable, in this case, the $3.5 trillion record, reconciliation bill. Here's what Ryan Cooper had to say about these dynamics. Democrats, I'm sorry, I haven't shared that with you yet. I will share the screen now. Democrats make governing much harder than it needs to be. I thought that one was really well titled. They go out of their way. They've gone out of their way for the last 7 months to make it much harder than it needs to be. And there's the Democrat. There's a Democratic donkey with a kick me sign on his back. And Ryan Cooper on August 10th. Don't look now, but it seems there will actually be some kind of bipartisan infrastructure deal. Enough Senate Republicans have agreed to the roughly $1 trillion package, including money for roads, bridges, broadband, and Amtrak, among other things. That is expected to be passed sometime Tuesday. Raised the question, are Democrats about to get played by Republicans once again? The answer is that is entirely up to them. Now is the time for House Democrats to stand firm and demand that 7 Democrats pass the party's own priorities before they accept the bipartisan compromise. I have to admit I was apparently too skeptical of the chances of a bipartisan bill getting through. Under President Obama, Republicans' signature move was to hold out the promise of bipartisan compromise, by dragging out negotiations for months and squandering precious congressional calendar time, only to pull back at the last second. In 2009, 2010, dim-witted and or corrupt Democrats, moderate Democrats, fell for this clumsy trick over and over and over, and I thought it would probably work again, but I was mistaken. However, it is still absolutely certain that Republicans are operating in bad faith here. If they're advancing this bipartisan bill, it's because they perceive that to be their best chance at blowing up the rest of the Biden agenda and thereby damaging the Democrats' political prospects. For the Republicans, it's always all about getting power back. The old goal of wasting tons of floor time has indeed succeeded. Now the GOP is almost certainly hoping that by agreeing to this bill, the moderate Democrats like Sinema and Manchin will get cold feet about the rest of Biden's policy program, and that will be the end of major policy making for the rest of his presidency. Biden's climax, in other words. It is worth noting again that both in terms of policy and in terms of the political objectives of the Democratic Party, the bipartisan bill is completely pointless. As Alex Perrine writes at the New York Times, the sole objective is to assuage a neurotic desire from a handful of Senate moderates like Manchin and Sinema to demonstrate that the Senate still functions. Quote, the Senate, with the White House's support, wasted months cajoling and rehabilitating a handful of key Republicans only to pass a smaller version of something Democrats could theoretically have passed entirely on their own. The whole process proved beyond any doubt that the Senate is a worthless obstacle to human flourishing. I like that. A worthless obstacle to human flourishing. If and when the deal, it makes the case to abolish the Senate, doesn't it? If and when the deal does pass, the Democrats' explicit intention is to pass another, much larger budget bill that can sidestep the filibuster through the reconciliation process, tacking on many of the party's objectives that weren't included in the bipartisan bill. The Republicans appear to have calculated if they didn't do something bipartisan, Manchin and Sinema would be forced to go along with the rest of their party. So they're trying to give them an escape hatch to start running away from liberal priorities. Senate Democrats released an outline of that second bill, what that second bill could look like Monday morning. And they've gone through the vote-a-rama already, and they're sent it to the committees already. However, one small but important thing is missing from that proposed reconciliation bill: an increase in the debt limit. The government is going to run out of legal borrowing authority in mid-September. They're already on emergency measures as of July 31st. The debt ceiling crisis is here, as I mentioned on numerous occasions. The Democrats are reportedly going to try to force Republicans to vote for a separate increase rather than just doing it themselves. And Ryan says, and I agree, this is almost unbelievably stupid, even for longtime students of Democratic blundering. This is very interesting, okay, in the face, okay, of William Rivers Pitt's article that Mitch is no longer the master of the Senate. I mean, Mitch has still got the debt ceiling weapon, and here are the Democrats doing something unbelievably stupid. Schumer is allowing them to do something unbelievably stupid because Biden seems to want to force the Republicans to do bipartisan. Anyway, the Republicans have already taken the debt limit hostage more than once, and their desire to inflict harm on the country to damage the Biden administration is right out in the open. Right now, in the midst of a resurgent pandemic that is again stuffing hospitals full to bursting, the Republican elites are spreading anti-vaccine propaganda and anti-mask propaganda also, and instructing their followers to ignore pandemic containment guidelines. Republican senators are publicly saying they will not vote for a debt ceiling increase without massive austerity measures that would ruin the economy and therefore Biden. I don't think there are going to be any Republican votes to increase the debt limit without some structural reforms, Senator Cornyn said to Politico. Furthermore, the debt ceiling is a pointless anachronism that does not exist in any other country except Denmark, where they have effectively abolished it, and is arguably unconstitutional. Yes, it is arguably unconstitutional. In any sane country, it's arguably unconstitutional because it involves forcing the federal government not to pay for appropriations that have already been passed. In other words, the debt ceiling, okay, that bill preceded the appropriations bills for this year. So, constitutionally speaking, the congressional appropriations for this year, which include the money that cannot now be spent because of the debt limit, have already repealed the debt limit because Congress gave the authority to spend beyond the debt limit in those appropriations. The debt limit bill is in conflict with the appropriations bill. That's why the debt limit bill would be unconstitutional in this instance. But the Supreme Court won't interfere with Congress tripping over its own shoestrings. And they'll deny standing to anybody else who wants to point out that the Congress is in conflict with itself. In any sane country, when the legislature votes to spend and tax, it is thereby voted to borrow the balance of revenue needed, as Ryan says. It is irresponsible politics to play chicken with the worst major political party in the developed world, and it is irresponsible policy not to clean up this poisonous legal idiocy while Democrats have the chance. It is. They could put in this bill repeal of the debt limit law. They could do that. They could put in this reconciliation bill to just repeal the debt limit law. That would be the end of it once and for all. Now, there is something that would give some sense to what I think is Biden's move, because I don't think that Schumer is so stupid he would do this by himself. But arguably, maybe Biden is. Okay. But anyway, perhaps Biden has something up his sleeve. Perhaps if the Republicans push him to the limit, he will make himself a hero by minting the $1 trillion coin or the $100 trillion coin and make the Republicans look totally stupid. He could do that. He could pass the reconciliation bill. They could come back in September with the debt ceiling, the whole country on tenterhooks, and then Biden says, okay, because you're doing this stupid thing and threatening to harm the country, I'm using the extraordinary measure of minting $1 trillion coins in order to remove the need to go over the debt ceiling. The $1 trillion coins will be used to pay down the debt so we can spend the appropriations that you idiots already voted for. That is what Biden needs to do. All this means that right now is an excellent time for progressives in the House, by which I mean not just the squad, but anyone who is in favor of Biden's agenda and wants to see him succeed as president, to hold the line and force Senate Democrats to behave. If the House pockets the bipartisan bill and refuses to move on it until they also have the reconciliation bill in hand from the Senate, including an abolition of the debt limit or at least a large increase, they can likely force through the whole thing. Make it clear to Sinema and Manchin that it's an all or nothing deal. Otherwise, Biden's entire presidency could run aground in a month. And that's why I called this episode the Biden, the climax of the Biden administration, because it really is the climax of the Biden administration. If they don't get through this now, his whole administration is deader than a doornail. He could still do a few good things, like he could put everyone on Medicare using Section 1881A of the Social Security Act. He could legalize marijuana. He could still mint the $100 trillion coin and take their austerity BS all away from them. And what's the fourth thing he could do? I forget. But he could do all those things still. But if he doesn't do this now, when he's got them, literally, he's got them exactly where he wants them, then he's not going to do anything. He's just going to prove again that he's feckless. Feckless. What?
He could give, what's his name? Ajadu.
He could give somebody Ajadu? Okay, folks. Kay says, I'm okay, Joe. I'm hating the heat wave here. And Lana says, yeah, we're hating the heat wave here, too. It was 97 today. A pretty bad day in Washington, D.C., but the temperature suddenly fell this evening. Last time we looked, it was down to 74. Lana says, I'm now too selfish to share. JK taking a Twitter break. Hi, Steve. And Kay shared, and Dolores says, good evening, everyone. Steve Wolfbrand says, hello, Steve. Michael Mann, client scientist, was on Hartman today. Scary. It is scary, isn't it? Carmen says, and the horrible tire burning in Kuwait is only making it worse. I know, isn't that awful? And Lana says, ugh, Dr. Joe, that is awful. Carmen says, I'm glad fascists at I'm glad fascist ass Florida is sinking. I'd never buy a house here or make roots. Steve says, damn, the ice just melted in my drink. This shit is becoming intolerable. And Kay says, there will be a meeting in Glasgow in November to discuss it nationwide.
Maybe they better do it next week.
And Evelina says, I'm worried about food scarcity. I read that at 1.5 degrees centigrade, agriculture is badly affected. Yeah, I guess everybody might have to eat hemp. I don't think hemp is affected at that temperature, but some of the things we like could be badly affected, yes. Hemp would probably still grow as fast as ever. And by the way, that would be very good for sequestering carbon in the soil. Evelina says, it is already happening here in the U.S. Oh, Kay says to Evelina, it is already happening here in the U.S. Evelina says, yes, the drought. And yes, the drought is awful. It's worse, I think, than in the Depression. And Kay says, yes, and the heat too, fires also. Steve says, Fauci is a pig, stole patents from subordinates, financed gain of function, germ warfare, no mask, then mask, then no mask, now mask again, there's blood on his hands. That may be, Steve, but it's clear that we do need to mask again, and it's clear that we do need to look beyond the vaccines to treatments that are effective against COVID. Kay says, they all need to tell the truth. Nobody really knows anything about this pandemic. I deny that, Kay. There are lots of scientists who have been studying it and studying it and studying it, and they know a considerable amount about it. They really do. I mean, a lot of the problem is that the governments, due to economic considerations, will not do what the scientists, are recommending to shut it down. In those countries where they have followed the recommendations of the scientists, such as in New Zealand, they have controlled it. They have controlled it. In Australia, they've largely controlled it, but of course they sometimes have not complied with the science there. In Taiwan, they were very good at first and for a very long time, but then they relaxed and the virus got out of control. But still, I don't think they still have had more than 40 fatalities per million. I mean, hell, if we had only 40 fatalities per million, we'd be flying high today. It wouldn't be any worse than the flu epidemic. So Lana says, yeah, now we have Delta and Lambda variants. We got Epsilon variants too, Lambda. I'm not sure, Lana, how serious the Lambda and the Epsilon variants are, but they are here now already, and we're going to find out. Steve says vaccinated people can now catch the Delta variant. They won't get very sick, but they can pass on the virus. Yeah, evidently, it's just as transmissible from vaccinated people as it is from the unvaccinated people. This is what has been found, in Israel. Something else that has been found, is that the immunity to the virus only seems to last for 6 to 8 months. So booster shots for people over 60. So booster shots are going to be needed. And in fact, supposedly the FDA is now right on the point of emergency authorization of the booster shots for Pfizer and for Moderna and maybe for some of the other vaccines too. I expect to hear sometime in the next month that Bonnie and I should get our booster shots at Kaiser. I'm fully expecting that. Okay, the Delta variant has 1,000 times the viral load of the Alpha original. I've heard 1,200 times, but yeah, roughly 1,000 times. Unvaccinated will get Delta, not if, but when. Herd immunity is now not possible. Evelina says food scarcity will increase pandemics if in some lands people have to resort to eating whatever is available. Evelina says, why not exactly? The thing about herd immunity, not sure. I agree, Steve. And Bonnie asks, doesn't the effect on the food chain scare the ad companies? Evelina says, how, Bonnie? Well, because they won't, if the food chain is hurt, they may not be able to produce the agricultural products. Kay says, my oldest sister died last night. Okay, I'm so sorry. She was the first child, of my adopted parents. I had to talk to my niece today about arrangements. I don't think I will be going to the funeral. She can't say if all are vaxxed. Since my sis and I have never really been close, I doubt I will take the chance. Shake my head. Evelyn says, sorry, Kay. I think I understand why you don't want to take a chance. I quite understand, Kay, why you don't want to take a chance. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, VP, the Build Back Better agenda, will create millions of jobs while tackling the climate crisis. Let's get this done. Gostart says the U.S. government is far too corrupt to do anything to stop climate change, and we're going to take down the rest of the planet with us. Yes, but we also have to admit that a lot of the rest of the planet is too corrupt also to do anything to stop climate change. Kay says, Evelina, I'm actually glad she is out of it at all, and she died in her sleep, so she was kind of lucky. She was 22 years older than me. Now, that means she must have been somewhere in her late 80s, right, Kay? Bonnie says, it is already scaring me. I think of buying seeds to grow some food in the apartment. And Kay says, Bonnie Firestone, get a few grow lights and go for it. Need advice on it? Ask me. I was a master gardener in North Carolina. Ghostut says, David Sirota, 2-hit is 2023 Twitter servers have melted from the heat of climate change, and the electricity grid is shutting down. You're kidding. The final tweet fired off before the earth goes dark is 7 emojis and a Biden hashtag on the profile. The tweet reads, quote, cry more, Bernie bro, unquote. Yeah, that's kidding. It's what the experts were saying today. I'm not a real doctor. I only play one on in-depth. If the vaccinated can catch and spread Delta, apparently herd immunity goes off the table. Well, it goes off the table, but it might eventually be attained when everybody has had COVID, right? Everybody's had COVID and survived it. There might be herd immunity for a while. Maybe a longer time for the virus to go dormant again. Bonnie says, I am sorry for your loss. Thank you, Bonnie Firestone. Not a big loss for me. She and I were never close, but I feel bad for her kids. Bonnie says, sorry, my computer is acting up. Steve Wolfbrand says, SpaceX SpaceLink is now online. We don't need the government for this shit. Elon has this covered. Evelina says, me too, mortifying, but I suspect all we see are rising prices. Food will be available for those who can pay. The urban poor will be scavenging unless there is a lot of solidarity in food rationing. Evelina says, some food rationing. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrand, I see what you mean. Kay says, I always say I have already forgotten more about gardening than most people ever know. Patrick's Time says, the big lie is that Biden won. Oh, Patrick, go away. Kay says, I seriously doubt this pandemic will ever be over, at least in my lifetime. Yes, I have my doubts too. Jim Locke says, hola. The highway portion of Biden's infrastructure bill works out to be less than $45 a year per person. Yeah, it's like it's like weak, weak, very weak tea. Kay says, wish I was young enough to go for the climate core. Oh, you mean the climate core, CORP, not CORE. Nancy says, my condolences, Kay. And Kay says, thank you, Nancy. Steve says, civilian climate corps. Who the fuck is that? The Boy Scouts.
Take anyone you can get.
Go start. The Senate just voted 95-3 for Hawley's amendment to add 100,000 new cops. Bernie Sanders, Mike Lee, Pat Toomey were the only dissenting senators. What would 100,000 cops mean for you and yours? It would probably mean 20 to 25% more killings, I think, every year, don't you think? Aren't there something like 300,000 cops now, or is it more? Maybe 30% more killings. Patrick says the bill has little to do with infrastructure and less crime. More crime. Your problem, Patrick, is that you don't understand that when the police kill somebody without cause, that's crime.
And it's not their fault.
Steve says, I think Hillary made that proposal on Epstein's plane to Pedo Island. Patrick says, defund the police movement has no support. Democrats have destroyed our cities. Well, that's probably true by definition because they're the mayors, okay, of most of the cities, but that doesn't mean that they've destroyed our cities. Maybe our cities were destroyed for many, many other reasons, but of course our cities are not all destroyed. Some of them are still pretty formidable cities.
What's McConnell doing to help save?
He's doing nothing to help to save the country.
What's he doing to help anybody?
He's not doing anything to help anybody. Evelina says, you're no help. Oh, laugh out loud. Jim Locke says, with a name as stupid as defund the police, why would anybody who hasn't been paying attention support it? That's right. That's true. It was not well done. It was grabbed as a slogan, and people just thought it was a good idea because of what it actually meant, but they didn't give any thought to the slogan. They needed to put in a slogan that could not be so easily used by the wingers. Now the wingers are just pummeling us with that slogan. Like Patrick's Time said, ask that to Cori Bush. Steve Wolfbrand says, mint the gazillion-dollar coin. We can always get change at 7-Eleven. Patrick says, Hunter Biden tells hooker Russian stole different laptop. Have videos of me doing fucking crazy sex. Patrick says Hunter is a disgrace. So are you, Patrick. Hunter may indeed be a disgrace, but you're a disgrace too. Ghostart says, Representative Jamal Bowman, hip-hop is the seed of black culture. At Senator Schumer, and I introduced a hip-hop resolution to officially recognize the contributions of hip-hop to the cultural fabric of America. And Kay says, go progressives, they better hold the vote. They better force the vote. Laura says, I like it too. Lana says, I like it too. Worthless obstacle. Yes, that is good, isn't it? Kay says, the Senate sucks. We need D.C. as a state so we'd have more good senators. That's true, but the Senate would still suck. It just sucks. We could have both D.C. and Puerto Rican senators, and it would still suck. We really need to get rid of it. Carmen says, lands. I like to use my made-up phrase, useless pools of pillow drool. Oh boy. Carmen says, Lana, sorry, stupid keyboard. And Lana says, what else were they voting on? The court was high for the Republicans, count was high for the Republicans, and something had passed. But I came in late and didn't arch what it was about. I think schools teaching about race theory. The count was high for the Republicans on something that passed. I think you're probably talking about the infrastructure bill. There were 19 Republicans who got involved in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, including Mitch McConnell himself. Nana says, agreed, Carmen. I'm so disgusted at this point. There's another reason I took a Twitter break. Can't handle Dems versus establishment and left infighting too. I can't deal with it. Kay says, our country is way too complicated to work well. Dem BS, not VS. Hate Dem BS and left infighting too. Hate this keyboard. Lana says, the stress that results. Carmen says, a lot of the stress that results from the fruits overwhelming my gut is in knots just from scanning the nose. Carmen says, from the frustration, not fruit, stupid autocorrect. Carmen says, I'm detecting Hulkamania. Laugh out loud. And Lana says, he could cancel student loans. Yes, he could cancel all the student loans, of course. How could I forget that? He could cancel all the student loans. If he did those four things, he might be able to win the presidency again. Of course, he'd get smashed in the Congress, so he still wouldn't be able to do anything. But at least he might be able to win the presidency again. That would, I suppose, help with the Supreme Court somewhat. Carmen says he could give us our 600. No, not without Congress, he can't. And Lana says, Teresa talks about food scarcity too. She planted a huge garden. And Carmen says, hemp seeds are a new thing. They are. They certainly are. Ohio, COVID-19 daily case count highest in 6 months. 3,393 new cases on Wednesday. Yes, I know it's highest in 6 months. It's everywhere. So Lana says, ugh, I don't want a booster shot. Wah, crying like baby. Yeah, none of us really wants a booster shot. And Lana says, sorry to hear that. Kay and Carmen says, I wish I could get a J&J booster. I felt so good for 2 weeks afterwards. Maybe you will be able to get a J&J booster. And Kay says, yes, Joe, she was in her late 80s. Dolores says, sorry for your loss, Kay. I completely understand your reasoning for not attending services. Some places have a live stream for those who are unable to attend. And Steve says, I bought a solar panel to charge my car. It melted in the sun. Kay says, thank you, Dolores Pierce. Start says, quote, repurpose the police. Hashtag repurpose the military. That's good. We could say repurpose the police. Carmen says, hashtag end police automatic immunity. Yes. And we also ought to end civil asset forfeiture, which is legalize the robbery by the police. Steve Wolfbrand says, recall Newsom. Feinstein is 88 and demented. A new Republican governor replaces her with a Republican. A Democratic majority is gone in the Senate. Get it now? It could well happen. Kay says, Ohio sucks badly. Yes, I suppose it does. Well, folks, I'm through with your comments at this point. I'll be back tomorrow night for another scintillating live stream. I might even have an interview tomorrow night. I will find out. I will see if I have an interview tomorrow night. Perhaps I can arrange one in any case. And Lana says, I believe Biden helped pass the asset forfeiture business. Yes, I think he did. I think you're right. Civil asset forfeiture, I think, does date from the crime bill. Steve Wilbrand says, good night. Laura says, thank you and good night all. Okay, and Lana says, okay, good night. Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion. I love you all. We love you too, Kay. Take it easy. Take it easy, everybody.